It's 6:40 a.m., October 13th, 1942, at Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. A battered Wildcat dropped out of the smoke over the runway, its engine coughing, the prop barely turning. Ground crews froze where they stood. The fighter slammed down, bounced once, and skidded across the strip until it finally stopped. When the dust settled, the damage was impossible to miss. Over 250 bullet holes, shredded wings, torn panels, fuel lines ripped open. Nobody expected movement inside. But the canopy lifted, and Joe Foss climbed out, steady, calm, completely unhurt. He stepped down from the wing while the men around him stared at the wreckage, trying to grasp how the plane was destroyed, but the pilot wasn't. Joe Foss came from the kind of place where big dreams usually died early. A small farm outside Sioux Falls, South Dakota, flat land, harsh winters, long days that started before sunrise and didn't end until the chores were done. His family wasn't wealthy, and when his father died suddenly in 1933, 18-year-old Joe had no time to grieve. He took over the farm, carried the responsibility of a man twice his age, and learned quickly that nobody was coming to save them. But even with work stacked on his shoulders, he kept one obsession alive: flying. He watched biplanes buzz over the cornfields and memorized engine sounds long before he ever sat in one. Every spare dollar he made, money most families used to buy clothes or fix roofs, Joe funneled straight into flying lessons at a tiny airfield outside town. The ground instructors knew him as the kid who arrived covered in dirt from the farm, but who flew like everything in his life depended on staying in the air. When war in Europe grew, he knew America would eventually join, and he wanted the cockpit more than anyone. So he hitchhiked hundreds of miles, sleeping in barns, riding in truck beds, to reach a naval recruiting station. He expected to be welcomed. Instead, they looked at his age and shrugged. 26, too old for fighters. We'll make you an instructor. Teaching rookies to fly while others fought? Not a chance. Joe pushed back harder than they expected, landing himself in advanced flight training through sheer stubbornness. At Pensacola, he wasn't the best student, and he certainly wasn't the clean-cut officer type. He was rough around the edges, older, and carried himself like someone who'd seen real hardship. But instructors noticed the important things. He stayed calm when others panicked. He never choked under pressure, and when given a gunnery test, he broke a record scored only by the Navy's top marksman. Even then, the Navy didn't fast-track him. They parked him as a flight instructor anyway. Weeks turned into months. He was itching for combat while younger, greener pilots shipped overseas. He refused to stay grounded. He volunteered for every assignment that touched a combat aircraft. He trained until he knew every quirk of the Wildcat by heart. He requested transfers so often that officers joked he was trying to break the system by persistence alone. Eventually, the system gave way. Joe Foss received orders for a combat unit headed into the Pacific. He packed everything he owned into one duffel bag. Before boarding, his mother hugged him tight, then pulled back and said the last words he'd hear from home for a long time. "If you get the chance to fly, don't waste it." He'd say. He didn't. The transport ship eased toward the shoreline under a dim Pacific dawn. Joe Foss stood on deck, watching the dark silhouette of Guadalcanal rise out of the mist. The island didn't look like the centerpiece of a desperate campaign, just a strip of jungle, mountains, and swamp. But everyone on that ship knew the truth. Whoever controlled this place controlled the doorway to Australia. The closer they came, the clearer the sounds grew: distant artillery, the thump of anti-aircraft guns, and a low, rolling echo that never seemed to stop. Marines called it the daily drumbeat. To newcomers, it was the sound of a battle already tipping toward collapse. Joe stepped onto the beach with a duffel bag, his flight gear, and a sense that he was walking into something far bigger than anything he'd trained for. A jeep picked him up and took him along a narrow jungle road toward Henderson Field. During the ride, he saw wrecked trucks, burned-out positions, and Marines with faces carved by sleepless nights. They weren't impressed by rank or training, only by who survived. When the jeep crested a small rise, Joe finally saw the airfield. Henderson wasn't a base, it was a scar in the jungle. The runway was pitted with shell holes. Craters overlapped each other. Fuel drums were stacked behind sandbags. Aircraft wrecks lined the tree line, some burned to their frames, others half buried in the mud where they'd crash, landed. It looked worse up close. Dust hung over the strip like fog. Ground crews moved slowly, exhausted from repairing planes that never stayed whole for more than a day. Wildcat fighters sat in a crooked line, patched with whatever scrap metal Marines could find, aircraft held together by welding, wire, and luck. Joe met the pilots he'd be flying with. 17, 18, 19, too young to vote, but already seasoned by weeks of brutal combat. Their uniforms were sun-bleached, their hands blistered, and their eyes carried the heavy, hollow look of men who had watched friends die faster than replacements could arrive. One pilot shook Joe's hand and said, "If you hear the alarms before breakfast, skip the breakfast." Another added, "If you hear them at night, stay away from the fuel dump unless you want to glow." There was no bravado, no swagger, only survival. The briefing officer gave Joe his first real sense of the situation. Japanese bombers attacked daily. Zeros swept in ahead of them. Artillery from ships offshore hit the field at night. Every sunrise meant another round of trying to keep the runway intact, long enough to get a few fighters airborne. Then came the line that stuck. "We lose planes faster than we can count them. We lose pilots even faster." Joe walked to the revetments where his assigned Wildcat waited. Mechanics were replacing a shredded control cable with a spare salvaged from a wreck. Tools lay scattered in the dirt. Every bolt, every hose, every panel was hand-fitted by men who had slept 3 hours in the last 20. The chief mechanic looked at him and said, "This plane isn't pretty, Lieutenant, but if you treat her right, she'll get you home once or twice." Joe didn't smile. He knew why the man said once or twice. That afternoon, the air raid siren wailed across the field, long, rising, and unmistakable. Pilots sprinted for their fighters. Ground crews dived into trenches. Black dots appeared on the northern horizon, glinting in the sunlight. It was Foss's first launch from Henderson Field. The moment his wheels left the ground, Joe understood exactly what kind of place he had come to. Guadalcanal wasn't a battlefield. It was a meat grinder suspended over the ocean, and he had just stepped into it at full speed. Joe reached altitude just as the Japanese formation broke through the clouds. The first thing he noticed wasn't their numbers, it was how clean and coordinated the Zeros looked. They moved like a single organism, banking and climbing with a precision he had never seen in training. There was no easing into combat on Guadalcanal, no warm-up fights, no gentle introduction. Foss rolled into the attack the moment a Zero drifted into his gun sight. He squeezed the trigger, felt the Wildcat's 650 caliber guns shake the cockpit, and watched bright flashes walk across the enemy's fuselage. The Zero burst into flame and spiraled down. His first kill. He didn't have time to celebrate. 3 more Zeros dropped onto him at once, one high, one low, one clawing into position behind him, their tracers stitched across his right wing, ripping cloth and metal in long, precise lines. Joe kicked the rudder, rolled hard, and dove straight through their formation, trying to force a merge that would break their angles. The Wildcat shook violently. More hits. More metal tearing away. A burst of fire struck so close it rattled the instrument panel. Joe kept fighting, jinking left, diving, climbing, pushing the aircraft harder than it wanted to go. He managed to slip behind one of the pursuers, fired a short burst, and saw it peel off trailing smoke. But the other 2 stayed glued to him, patient and disciplined. Every time he tried to extend, they closed the distance. Every time he tried to climb, they slid into firing position. His engine began to cough. Oil pressure dropping. Temperature spiking. The Wildcat had taken more punishment in 90 seconds than it was ever designed for. Joe squeezed everything out of the engine, skimming the treetops until the ground blurred beneath him. A Zero stayed locked to his tail, firing in controlled bursts. A round shattered his canopy rail. Another tore through the fuselage behind his seat. The engine finally gave up. It sputtered, coughed twice, and died. Joe was gliding. No power, no climb, no time. He aimed for a clearing past the runway, pulled back just enough to keep the nose up, and hit the ground in a jarring slap. The Wildcat skidded through dirt and brush, tore through a line of small palms, and lurched into a shallow ditch. The cockpit filled with smoke. The windshield cracked. The harness dug into his shoulders as the plane came to a violent stop. For a moment he sat still, trying to understand whether he was hurt. He wasn't. Again. He shoved the canopy open and climbed out as ground crews ran toward him through the smoke. They reached him expecting injuries. Instead, they found him wiping dust from his collar and looking back at the wreck as if he were trying to calculate how many seconds he had bought himself by stretching that glide. What shook the men around him wasn't the crash. It was the quiet way he walked away from it, as if surviving the impossible was part of the job. Later that day, during a brief lull, He looked across the revetments at the exhausted young pilots who had watched him go down. They didn't cheer his first kill. They were waiting to see whether he would take the next mission with the same calm they needed from a leader. Joe understood what their eyes were telling him. They needed someone to follow. Someone who stayed steady when everything else was falling apart. The war had chosen that role for him faster than he expected. The next morning, Joe inspected the replacement Wildcat assigned to him. Replacement was a generous word. The aircraft looked like it had been assembled from 3 different wrecks, patchwork panels, uneven rivets, a fresh coat of paint that barely hid the scars underneath. Ground crews were proud of it anyway. On Guadalcanal, a plane that could get airborne was already a luxury. Joe ran his hand along the wing and tapped the panel near the gun ports. 6 guns? He asked. The crew chief nodded. That's what she came with. Joe shook his head. Take 2 out. Joe pointed at the ammo belts. We're short on 50 cal. I'd rather have 4 guns with full belts than 6 guns that run dry in 20 seconds. It wasn't standard doctrine. It wasn't even regulation. But on Guadalcanal, doctrine didn't matter. Results did. The crew chief gave a slow nod, the kind Marines reserved for men who had proven themselves in fire. Within an hour, Foss had a lighter Wildcat, tuned to fire longer, hit harder, and dive faster. That small act, changing the gun loadout, ended up defining the group of pilots who gathered around him in the following days. They were young, hungry, and raw, but they watched everything he did, how he set his convergence, how he rolled into an attack, how he used the Wildcat's weight to force a zero into a mistake. They began copying him, flight after flight. During briefings, they hovered near him not because of rank. He had none of the formality of a senior officer, but because he spoke plainly and never wasted time on theatrics. Every word came from experience. Close the distance, he told them. Zeros are faster in the climb. Don't fight them there. Use your dive. Hit them at 200 yards. Pilots scribbled it down. Others repeated it under their breath. Soon, when Joe headed to his plane, 6 or 7 of them trailed behind him automatically, like a small pack orbiting its center of gravity. Someone joked that the group looked like an old circus act, a ringmaster with his performers. The name stuck. Foss's Flying Circus. It wasn't an official squadron, but everyone on the island knew who they were. They flew the hardest missions. They launched on the shortest warnings. They were the first in the air when bombers appeared on the horizon, and the last to land when fuel ran down to fumes. Marines teased them for their swagger, but it wasn't arrogance. It was the confidence that came from watching Joe dive through enemy formations without hesitation, and from surviving long enough to believe that maybe they could do the same. Their morale didn't come from speeches or ceremonies. It came from the rhythm of combat they fell into together. Launch, climb, fight, repair, sleep if possible, then repeat. They learned each other's flying habits within days. Who held formation tight? Who tended to drift high on right turns? Who needed a quick signal before pushing into a merge? Who would be there when things went bad? By the second week, something new began to show in their missions, an aggressiveness that hadn't been present before Foss arrived, a willingness to attack even when outnumbered, a belief that they could win dogfights they had no right to survive. The tempo of the campaign changed the moment Foss's Flying Circus began flying regular sorties. Every single day brought a new threat, a new formation on the horizon, or a new reason to scramble before breakfast. The sky over Guadalcanal never stayed quiet for long. Most mornings started with the same sequence: the distant thump of ship guns, the rising wail of the air raid siren, and the sudden scramble of pilots running across the strip while mechanics yanked chocks from landing gear. Sleep became optional. Rest became a luxury nobody could afford. For Joe, the days blended together, climbing into the cockpit before the engine had time to warm, lifting off the runway that was still smoking from night bombardments, and aiming straight toward whatever the Japanese were sending next. Some mornings it was bombers, Bettys and Nells flying tight V formations, engines glinting in the sunlight. Foss preferred diving through their escorts instead of going around them. He believed the fastest way to reach the bombers was to punch a hole straight through the zero screen. The younger pilots followed him without hesitation. Other days brought nothing but long, punishing fighter sweeps, 20, 30, sometimes more zeros trying to wear down Henderson Field by sheer persistence. Joe fought them in short, violent bursts, using the Wildcat's dive speed and armor to stay alive, forcing the fight into angles where the Zero's agility mattered less. He nearly crashed multiple times. Once when his elevator cable jammed, once when his fuel tank took a round and began leaking in a shimmering trail, And once when his canopy fogged over so completely after a climb that he had to fly half blind, wiping it with his sleeve until he could see again. Every landing was a gamble. The strip was cratered, muddy, and littered with debris from previous fights. On bad days, Wildcats landed so low on fuel that their engines died before the wheels touched dirt. One pilot skidded in with less than a quarter-gallon left. Nobody laughed. It could have been any of them. Fatigue hit harder than the dogfights. Pilots flew twice, sometimes 3 times a day. Nights were spent in foxholes while Japanese destroyers shelled the field. Sleep was interrupted by explosions, shaking the ground and the clatter of shrapnel slicing through palm trees. Yet nearly every morning, Foss's small group launched again. Joe's kill count started climbing almost immediately. 5 victories in less than a week. 8 by the next. By the 9th day, he had reached ace status, something most pilots never accomplished in their entire careers. But the real change wasn't in Joe's numbers. It was in the way the young pilots fought. They began closing to the same point-blank range Joe preferred. 200 yards, sometimes less. They coordinated dives with tighter timing. They protected each other more aggressively. They learned to identify danger a split second sooner, to roll out of a trap before it fully formed, and to keep moving even when the odds weren't favorable. The Japanese noticed. Intelligence reports began referring to a new, unusually aggressive flight group operating out of Henderson Field. They didn't know the pilots' names, but they recognized the pattern: tight dives, sudden angles, accurate bursts that broke formations apart. During one afternoon attack, Foss's group tore through a bomber formation so quickly that ground observers counted enemy planes dropping out of the sky before the bombers even reached the field's perimeter. Marines watched the entire engagement from foxholes and trenches, cheering as Wildcats streaked overhead with the sun flashing off their wings. By the end of the first month, the flying circus had carved out a reputation that spread across the island. If Foss's group was in the air, the field had a chance. All of this was only the build-up. The worst night, and the most defining morning, hadn't come yet. Just after 1 a.m., the first Japanese flares drifted down over Henderson Field, white, blinding, turning the jungle into harsh daylight. A second later, the naval guns opened up. Shells from cruisers and destroyers offshore slammed into the runway, throwing dirt, metal, and flaming debris into the air. The ground shook like an earthquake. Tents collapsed. Fuel drums burst open. Aircraft in the revetments caught fire one by one, lighting the palm trees in orange glow. Pilots and ground crews hit the dirt, covering their heads as steel fragments tore overhead. Every few minutes another flare dropped, illuminating the field so the Japanese gunners could correct their aim. Each explosion stepped closer to the Wildcats, the ones still intact, rare, valuable, barely held together by months of combat and repairs. There was nowhere safe. Foxholes flooded with smoke and dust. Shrapnel cut into the sandbags like knives. The bombardment lasted more than an hour, each blast rolling across the island like thunder. By the time the shelling stopped, Henderson Field looked like it had been chewed open. Craters covered the runway. Burning aircraft lit the eastern edge of the strip. One of the maintenance huts was gone entirely, nothing left but scattered tools and fragments of corrugated metal. The Marines fought the fires with whatever they could grab: helmets, jackets, extinguishers that barely worked. Pilots stumbled out of dugouts, coughing, covered in dirt, checking to see if their aircraft still existed. The Japanese plan was simple: destroy the field by night, take it by morning. At dawn, they sent in the finishing blow. Lookouts spotted the incoming formation first, bombers with 0 escorts, heading straight for the smoking wreck of the airfield. If they got through, there wouldn't be anything left to defend. Pilots ran for their planes. Foss reached his Wildcat and climbed in while mechanics yanked away debris still lodged under the wings. Another crewman pulled a dented fuel hose off the ground and shouted something Joe couldn't hear over the rising engine noise. 2 Wildcats failed during startup. Another burst a hydraulic line. That left 6 fighters. 6 to face an entire incoming Japanese strike. Joe didn't hesitate. He throttled up and rolled through a gap between 2 craters, lifting into the air before the wheels had fully locked. The others followed, climbing as fast as engines allowed. Smoke from the night bombardment still drifted over the field, turning the sky patchy and uneven. As they punched through the haze, the enemy formation spread out in front of them. Layered rows of bombers, flanked by fighters, descending to wipe out the airfield once and for all. Joe pushed the nose down and dove straight into them. His first burst ripped into a Zero that was moving to block him. The plane exploded into fragments. He pulled up, rolled left, and slid behind a bomber, firing into its right engine until it erupted into flame. The bomber fell away, dragging smoke like a burning comet. Another Zero tried to climb onto his tail. Joe snapped into a hard dive, the kind pilots avoided because it pushed the Wildcat to the edge of structural failure. The Zero overshot. Joe reversed, squeezed the trigger, and tore the fighter apart with a 2-second burst. He climbed again, fuel low, ammunition halfway gone. But the formation was breaking. Marines on the ground watched the entire battle unfold above them, tiny specks twisting through the smoke, each flash of gunfire marking another moment of survival or death. In less than 30 minutes, the Japanese assault lost momentum. Too many bombers shot down. Too many fighters disrupted. Their tight formation was now scattered, unstable, unable to coordinate the strike. Joe landed briefly to refuel and rearm, engines still running, then launched again without stepping out of the cockpit. On this second run, he dropped 2 more zeros, pushing his tally for the morning to 5. The 6 Wildcats of Henderson Field had done the impossible. They had broken a major Japanese attack with scraps of fuel, patched-up aircraft, and sheer refusal to give the airfield up. That morning became legend on the island. Ground crews didn't talk about tactics or numbers. They talked about the moment they saw Foss pull his Wildcat around for another pass, even when the sky was full of enemy fighters and the runway was still burning. Nothing about the day felt heroic to the pilots. It was survival, brutal, urgent, necessary. But for the men on the ground, it was something else entirely. Proof the Japanese could be stopped in the air, even against overwhelming odds. And it set the stage for what would come next. By late October, everyone on Guadalcanal felt the tempo shift. The Marines on the ridge were still fighting for every yard of jungle, but overhead, something else was happening, something the Japanese didn't expect. Foss and his 7 pilots had settled into a rhythm that made their small flight hit far above its weight. Joe wasn't the most graceful aviator, and the Wildcat wasn't the fastest machine in the sky, but together they built a lethal pattern the Japanese kept underestimating. Their engagements stopped looking like chaotic dogfights and started looking like controlled hunts. Joe cut distance fast, fired only when he was close enough to see the enemy canopy, then rolled out before anyone could return the favor. His men mirrored every move, learning the timing, the discipline, and the nerve it took to fly that way. The Wildcat's 6 50 cal machine guns could shred a Zero in less than a second, but they also bled ammunition at an alarming rate. Foss knew it, felt it every time he squeezed the trigger. That's why he removed 2 guns, fewer barrels, more endurance, same stopping power at close range. It wasn't written in any manual, but it gave him the edge he needed, and his men followed suit. Day after day, they launched through damaged runways and columns of smoke, meeting Japanese formations that always seemed larger, cleaner, and better supplied. But numbers stopped mattering. Foss's flight attacked from altitude when possible, from the sun when lucky, and from pure instinct when neither advantage was available. And the scoreboard started climbing. A Zero clipped at the merge, a Betty bomber spiraling over Iron Bottom Sound, recon birds trying to slip past the coast and never making it home. 1 kill became 5, 5 became 15, and soon every pilot in the group carried a record that would have made a veteran proud. Maintenance crews patched bullet holes through the night, scavenged parts from wrecks, siphoned fuel from damaged birds, anything to keep the Wildcats in the air. By the time the fight reached its peak, the statistics were stunning. In just 90 days, the 7 Marines of Foss's flying circus destroyed 72 Japanese aircraft, an impossible number on an island that was supposed to fall weeks earlier. Foss accounted for 26 of them. The rest came from the men who followed him into the sky, trusting his judgment, his nerve, and his willingness to be the first Wildcat into the fight. Guadalcanal was still burning on the ground, but above the island, the balance had shifted for good. By December, the tempo of the air war had changed. Japanese raids still came, but not with the same force, not with the same confidence. The worst of Guadalcanal's chaos had passed, leaving behind a quieter kind of exhaustion, one that seeped into every corner of the airfield. It hit Joe hardest. The fever arrived without warning. One morning he woke drenched and shaking, unable to lift his head from the cot. The medics recognized malaria immediately. Within hours he was too weak to stand, drifting in and out of awareness, while aircraft engines rose and fell somewhere outside the thin canvas walls. Ground crews patched Wildcats without him. Pilots scrambled without him. The runway thundered as his men launched sorties he should have been leading. Days later, the fever finally broke. His weight had dropped, his strength hollowed out, but the moment he could walk without help, he made his way back to the flight line. No speeches, no announcement. He simply showed up, strapped in, and waited for the signal. January 15th, 1943. His first flight since the illness. The Japanese arrived just as he cleared the coastline. A cluster of Zeros dove from altitude, hunting for returning Marine bombers. Joe climbed toward the fight, cut across their turn, and dropped the first one cleanly. Moments later, a second fell in smoke, then a third. 3 kills in a single flight, after weeks in a sickbed. When he rolled to a stop on the runway, the cheering wasn't from adrenaline, it was relief. The squadron had its commander back, but the officers waiting beside the dispersal hut brought different news. Washington had issued direct orders. Joe Foss was to return home immediately. The paperwork spelled out why. Across 3 months of combat, every kill had been logged, verified, and compared against national records. His tally had reached 26 confirmed victories, matching Eddie Rickenbacker's benchmark from the First World War. Joe had spent the campaign focused on keeping his pilots alive. Only now, as he packed his gear for departure, did he learn what those months of flying had amounted to. Not just the top Marine Corps score, but the highest American total of the war at that moment. Guadalcanal kept burning behind him, but the work he came to do was done. Joe Foss came home to a country that already knew his name. Newspapers had printed his victories for months. Radio hosts spoke about him as if he were a myth pulled from some earlier century. None of it felt real to him. Guadalcanal had been too loud, too chaotic, too costly for the word hero to sit comfortably. He wasn't interested in parades or speeches. He'd seen too many empty seats in ready rooms to enjoy attention built on numbers. The pilots he'd trained, flown with, and buried, those were the names that stayed with him, not the 26 etched beside his own. But the country wanted him visible, so he traveled. Bond drives, interviews, uniforms pressed and medals pinned by people who'd never heard a Zero's engine or felt a Wildcat shudder under fire. Joe stood through it all, polite, steady, grateful, but never convinced it said anything true about war. When the tour finally ended, he didn't chase the spotlight. He returned to work, built businesses, served his state, raised a family, and lived in a way that made sense to him. Quiet effort, steady responsibility, the same traits that carried him through the jungle heat and sleepless nights on Guadalcanal. Across the years, his legacy took shape in unexpected places. Crop duster pilots learning precision flying, young Marines hearing his name in flight school, governors citing his resilience, and football fans unknowingly watching the championship concept he once proposed. None of those successes erased what happened in the Pacific, but they added something the war never could: normalcy, purpose, a life that kept moving forward. And yet the truth stayed simple. Joe Foss survived things that should have killed him. A Wildcat torn open by gunfire, a crash into the sea, hours drifting in dark water, streaks of tracer fire cutting past his canopy, sickness that almost stopped his heart. Every time the odds closed in, something carried him through. Discipline, luck, instinct, maybe all three. But the figure who stepped off the transport ship wasn't invincible. He was a farm kid who grew up too soon, learned to lead because others needed him, and kept showing up long after fear or logic should have told him to stop. His story endures because it isn't about a perfect pilot. It's about a man who faced everything designed to break him, and kept flying anyway.